This video tells the story of one pilot's year of combat during the Vietnam War. The time was from August 1968 to August 1969. The pilot was Perry Smith, a 33-year-old Air Force major. He flew out of Udorn Air Base, a large facility in northern Thailand. Udorn was close to the neighboring country of Laos. Every combat mission was flown in formation with one or more aircraft. Perry flew 50 missions over North Vietnam and 130 missions over Laos. He flew no missions over South Vietnam or Cambodia. His aircraft was the F-4D Phantom II. Each aircraft had two crew members, a pilot in the front seat and a pilot or navigator in the back seat. From the very start of his combat tour, Perry was aware that he was in a very special fighter squadron, the renowned Triple Nickel. This squadron was destined to earn 3 Presidential Unit citations during the Vietnam War. It is quite an honor for a unit to earn this award. It is extraordinary for a unit to earn 3. Throughout the Vietnam War, no other Air Force squadron earned more. Prior to arrival at Udorn, Major Smith had flown fighter aircraft for 6 years in F-84s and F-100s in the late 1950s and early 60s. After checking out in the F-4 at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, Perry and his backseater, Lieutenant Ron Hensey, ferried an F-4 from Utah to Da Nang Air Force Base in South Vietnam. After completing jungle survival school in the Philippines, they arrived at Udorn in late August 1968.
My association with the Triple Nickel Squadron started about 50 years ago in the summer of 1968 when I learned that I was going to be assigned to this incredible squadron. It had a wonderful reputation of probably being the best fighter squadron in the Vietnam War, and I was going to be assigned there. The next step was to how to get there. I was at Florida learning how to fly the F-4, and I asked to have the permission to fly an F-4 all the way to the theater, and they gave me permission. So I took off with my backseater, Ron Hensey, from Hill Air Force Base. We show up at the Triple Nickel Squadron. We were greeted. They were happy to see us. We had a front seater and a back seater ready to fly. And they said, "Oh no, you can't fly combat with us." I said, "Why not? You haven't gone through snake school. You haven't gone through jungle survival school." So we had to go all the way back to the Philippines, go through a 4 or 5 day course in how to survive in a jungle environment, and then we had to fly all the way back to Udorn by going through Bangkok and all that. So finally we get to Udorn. We get what's called our dollar ride. They take us up in an F-4 and we fly around. It's a little bit of combat, but not much. And the next day or two, we started flying combat. My backseater and I knew each other well because we'd gone through training together, and that was very helpful, and we were getting into combat right away. And so then that started what ended up being 180 combat missions. 50 of those were over North Vietnam, and the rest of them were over Laos. In some cases we were shot at a lot, some cases we were shot at a little, and in some cases we weren't shot at all. Sometimes you didn't even know whether you were being shot at because sometimes they had tracers, sometimes they had exploding weapons, but sometimes they didn't. But it wasn't all that hazardous in most cases because we stayed high. We didn't get below 4,500 feet before we released the weapons and got out of there, and most of their weapons wouldn't reach real high. So I would say it wasn't all that dangerous an operation, although it was in combat, and at times it became pretty exciting. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about a few of my combat experiences that are interesting, and then talk about some other things that happened during that full year that we had. We were there exactly 1 year, from August of 1968 to August of 1969. Now that's 50 years ago, so I'm giving you memories, recollections of things that happened a very long time ago. So everybody or anybody who's watching this video will have to forgive me if I say things that are not quite right. I have memories that are a bit faulty, but it's the best that I can do. I've gotten a lot of help from a lot of people pulling stories together, and I hope it's a reasonably reliable rundown of what we have here over the course of a year a year of combat in a 50 years in the past. The most memorable mission that I had during the entire year that I was at Udon, Thailand, took place on the 22nd of February in 1969. And that was when my leader got shot down and we had to go into a rescue operation. We were flying over the Plain of Jars, which is an area in Laos which is open. It's one of the few places in Southeast Asia that's kind of like a plain instead of jungle. And it's maybe 30 miles by 30 miles. It's a pretty nice looking area. My leader rolled in, and as he rolled in, all of a sudden, all I could see was a big ball of flame and a bunch of smoke. And the front, I could see the very front end of his airplane. So he was really in bad shape, and he was headed toward the ground pretty fast. So I yelled at him on the radio. I said, "Eject, eject, eject." I used his call sign, "Eject, eject." They kept going down and down, going down and going down. I kept yelling at him, "Eject." And finally, right before the airplane hit the ground, we saw one parachute. We didn't see two. And the front seater never got out, and he was killed. But the back seater did get out. So that we knew there was somebody on the ground whose parachute had opened, or it looked like it had opened. And so we're calling him, and I'm calling him, and I'm calling him for about 20 minutes, just rotating around at high altitude, hoping to pick him up. And finally I hear him speaking, and he identifies himself by code, so we know he's the back seater, and he sounds very, very frightened. And so I asked him, I said, "How you doing, Mike?" His name was Mike. I said, "How you doing, Mike?" He says, "I'm not doing well." I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "I'm afraid of the tigers." And I said, "What in the world is he talking about?" So I asked my back seater, Ron Hinsey, who was sitting right behind me in the airplane, what in the world he's talking about. He says, "Oh, he's been reading a book about the Laotian tigers in northern Laos, and he's afraid there are tigers around, they're going to grab him." And, well, there are very few tigers in central Laos, and so I told him, forget about the tigers, just get away from your airplane, get away from your chute, and go hide, because we've got the helicopters on the way. In the meantime, I've called the agency that's responsible for rescue, and so they're sending Jolly Green Giant helicopters, they're sending A-1 airplanes, they're sending a lot of stuff in his direction. So I told him that, they're on the way, we're going to get you. I said, "How you doing now?" He says, "Not well." So this is the second time he said not well. I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "I'm bleeding really, really bad." So I said, "Okay, pull off your t-shirt, make a tourniquet, and cut off the blood." He says, "I can't do that." I said, "Why not?" He says, "It's my head." What had happened is his chute had not fully opened, and so he lost his helmet because he ejected at a very high speed, and he hit a tree. And when he hit a tree, he spliced his head open. It ended up, I think, 35 stitches right down here on his head. And so when you have a head wound like that, you're bleeding pretty badly. So I said, compress that t-shirt and hold it as hard as you can with both hands against your head, and we're going to get you out of there. Well, he called about every 10 minutes. He really was worried. Where are the helicopters? Where are the helicopters? Where are the helicopters? Finally, the helicopters show. One comes in high, one comes in low. The one that's low lowers a man on the jungle penetrator. He goes over, grabs Mike, puts him in the jungle penetrator. They go up together, being winched back up, and they called me and they said, "We got him." And of course, that was a very emotional moment because we knew we got him out of there. And they went back to the Udon where they were stationed. Well, I had a much faster airplane, so I zipped back to Udon, got out of the airplane, and ran down to where the helicopter was going to land. And when I got down there, I hoped to talk to Mike, but they had him all bundled up, and off they went. I didn't get to talk to him, but I did talk to the sergeant who went down to get him. I said, "How did it go?" He said, "It didn't go well." That's the third time something didn't go well. I said, "What didn't go well?" He said, "He was so slippery that I almost dropped him." He said, "I had to hang on to him with everything I had. We got him up there." And so Mike then went off, badly hurt, went to the Philippines, got sewn up, and stayed gone for 2 or 3 months. But it was a successful operation. As soon as I called the rescue agency, which was an airborne airplane, a 130 called Crown, his full job, that airplane's full job, was to rescue people. And so he immediately then orchestrates the rescue. He gets the helicopters in the air, he gets the He gets the A-1 airplanes in the air, which are these slow airplanes that are in support area. He lets everybody know what's going on. He tells everybody to stay out of that area because we're going to have a rescue operation going on. So he orchestrates it. I am in a support role at that time. My big problem was everybody in the area, F4s and F105s, they all wanted to come in and help. And we couldn't use them because the enemy was not closing in on him, and there was no place to drop bombs. And we had a forward air controller there, and he was watching very carefully. But everybody wanted to help. And of course, somebody that really did help was the tanker, because I was running out of gas. And the tanker, who was not authorized to come in enemy territory, he was not authorized to fly into Laos. He says, "Do you need me?" And I said, "Yep." He came right into enemy territory so I could get gas. Of course, we were high and he was pretty safe. But when I asked for help, he gave help. So the big story was everybody in that whole area came to help, and we got him out. Now, when I landed my airplane, the crew chief of the airplane that had been shot down approached me. He says, "What happened? What happened to my airplane?" He had tears in his eyes. And I said, "Well, it looks like it was shot down. I'm not quite sure, but it sure looked bad." He said, "Did I do anything wrong?" And I said, "Oh, no, you didn't do anything wrong. We were flying in combat. People, that's what happens sometimes." But I'd forgotten how closely these enlisted guys, these crew chiefs, feel about their airplane. It was their baby. He'd been with it for months, and it was now gone. He didn't have an airplane anymore. So that hit him really, really hard. The other thing, of course, talking to the guy who rescued him and went down on the jungle penetrator. Now, here was an impressive guy. He was a big, strong, muscular sergeant from the Special Forces, Special Operations folks of the Air Force, and he knew what he was doing, and he did it really well. And I had enormous respect for the helicopter guys in the first place. I'd have even more respect for him going down there in enemy territory, going over, finding him, bringing him over, carrying him over, getting on the jungle penetrator and going up. So he did just a terrific job. The final aspect of that story is after the guy who was wounded so badly was all sewn up at the hospital during his period of rehabilitation, he became an instructor in the jungle school, in the snake school, and they loved him because he had just gone down and been rescued. So he told them what it was all like and how it worked and all that business. And he did that for a couple of months until he was fully recovered, and then he asked to come back to combat. He didn't have to. He could have gone home. He said, "I want to go back to my squadron." He came back to the squadron, and he later became my backseater when my backseater went on and flew another situation. So we became very close friends as all that. But that was probably the most exciting and most interesting mission that I had during the full year I was over there. But there were others. And the next story I want to tell is the story of the gunships, the C-130 gunships. They were called Spectres. And they worked at night, and they had big guns on the side, and they would pick up the enemy convoys by electronic means, and then they would shoot these guns at the enemy convoys. They'd hit the first truck and the last truck, and then they'd work on the rest of the trucks. The problem was everybody on the ground wanted to shoot them down, and so you'd watch all these streaming tracers coming up, lots of them coming up at 130, and on one occasion, there were so many tracers coming up right close to the 130, I finally told the 130 guy, I was providing escort to him, I said, "You got to go home." "Oh, no, I can't go home." "You got to go home. You're going to get shot down." I said, "You go home and we'll take care of the convoy," because by this time we knew where the convoy was because he had destroyed the first truck and it was on fire. He destroyed the last truck and it was on fire. So you kind of knew where the convoy was. And then we went in with our weapons. We had CBUs, cluster bomb units. We had 11 of them. And we would go in and drop one at a time on the guns as they started shooting. And there were times when the guns were shooting at us. And I remember one time I went down and there were about 6 gun positions all shooting at me. And I was sure I was going to get hit. But I didn't. And in fact, I was there for 180 missions and I was never hit by any aircraft fire or by SAMs or anything like that, which is really remarkable. But on the other hand, we moved the airplanes around a lot. We stayed pretty high. They didn't want to turn their radars on because then people would go after them. And so they were pretty inaccurate as far as their business is concerned. So that was another mission that I had. But there was a follow-on to that escorting the Spectres. About that time, the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, on separate trips about a week apart, came to Udorn, and they wanted to get briefed. Well, this is a brand new mission of escorting the Spectres, so somebody had to brief him. Well, guess who got to brief him? I got to brief him. I'd been over there now for about 10 months, so I had a lot of experience. Well, if you're ever going to have credibility in any kind of a briefing or a speech, that was the day I had credibility, because I had been flying a lot of combat. They had not been flying combat. They really wanted to know about the mission, so I was able to lay the whole thing out. And we used to take tape recorders in the airplane, so I could play back the dialogue that I was having with my wingman and also with the airplane. And some of it got very exciting. You could hear the voices of the pitch would go up, and I would brief them, play some video, or play some audio back to them, and then of course they'd ask questions. And one of the questions I was asked by the Secretary of the Air Force was, "Have you got all the things you need, all the munitions you need?" And I said, "No, sir, we don't. We don't have Rockeye, which is a special munition that would go against anti-aircraft guns particularly." And he says, "Well, we got to give him some Rockeye." Well, later, as he left, a Major General came up to me and says, "How come you don't have Rockeye, Major?" I said, "Well, sir, I don't really know." "Well, you get some," he said. "You get some." Well, it wasn't really my job as a fighter pilot to demand that we get Rockeye, but he wasn't happy that I told the Secretary that we didn't have the kind of things we wanted. But that was interesting because Udorn had visitors all the time. We had 26 different missions at Udorn. We had F-4s, we had RF-4s, which were reconnaissance airplanes. We had AV-CCC, which were control airplanes. We had Jolly Green Giants. We had all kinds of CIA missions that were flying out of there. And so you'd go to the bar at Udorn, this big bar. You know, imagine how many different people. Some people could talk to you, and some people couldn't because they had so many secret missions. But dignitaries came all the time to Udorn to try to find out what was going on, and they were getting briefed by this. So I had the opportunity to brief quite a few people when I was there. One of the more interesting experiences I had when I first got over there in the fall of 1968 was when John McCain's dad came to town. Admiral, full four-star Admiral John McCain, commander of the Pacific Command, and he was our commander directly up. We didn't work for Westmoreland. We worked for this guy. And he came to town, and he walked into our squadron. I never will forget this. And he says, "Okay, I don't want anybody in this room that doesn't fly combat over North Vietnam." So everybody the intelligence officer, the logistics officer, maintenance officer, all these other folks, they all had to leave. So now he's in a room with nothing but fighter guys who are flying combat. And he says, he's a little tiny little guy. He says, "You tell me what we're doing right. You tell me what we're doing wrong. I want to get my son out of there. He's over there. You know he's over there." He had been captured by that time. So we laid it out really, really hard. Things that we needed to be doing. There were too many sanctuaries. We weren't allowed to hit so many targets. We basically made the point, you can't win the war with air power if you take so many of our targets away from them. We couldn't hit ships in the harbor. We couldn't hit the railroads. We couldn't hit the airports. There were a lot of things we couldn't hit. And so we didn't think we were doing particularly well. We weren't doing particularly well, and we told him we weren't doing it. We hoped that he would pick up on that, go back and say, "Okay, we're going to let you do things." But he was constrained by McNamara and the Pentagon, and so he was never able to help us get the kind of missions that we really needed to do. But he was really sincere about being there, and we didn't hold anything back. We told him exactly what we felt like. Now, I was brand new at the time, so I never said anything, but the old guys, the people who've been around for a long time, did, so he was interested. That was the fall of 1968. Whenever we had somebody who was finishing their last mission, and they were safe, they were going to be alive, they were going to go home, there were a number of traditions. First of all, they got hosed down by the fire department as they got out of their airplane, and they really got wet. Champagne bottles were opened, and we had that right on the flight line. And then the tradition was, before they went home, they got thrown over the bar at the club. It was a tradition. I don't remember who started it, but there it was. And so one day, I was talking to the wing commander, who was a full colonel, who was already on the list to become a brigadier general. And he was leaving within a couple of days. And I was standing there having a beer with him. And I said, "Sir, has anybody thrown you over the bar yet?" He says, "Well, no, they haven't." I said, "Sir, would you like to be thrown over the bar?" He says, "Oh, yes, I would like to be," because that meant he was a legitimate fighter pilot. I would like to be thrown over the bar. Now, this is a senior guy. You see, he's the big boss of this whole place. And so I got some of my friends together, and I went behind the bar and got the bartenders ready and moved the glass out of the way so they would catch him. And over the top he goes. Oh, we throw the soon-to-be general over the top, and then he comes around to the front of the bar and he buys drinks for everybody in the bar. That's the tradition and all that business. So that was fun. He really wanted to be thrown over, and we threw him over. The friendships that one develops in a combat situation, of course, are very close. We always talk about that, and they are, and we have a lot of friends who we got going. And the Triple Nickel Squadron has continued on ever since that time, and it is now located in Aviano, Italy. We flew F-4 airplanes. It then moved to an F-15 airplane, and now it's an F-16 airplane. And right now, at the time that we're doing this interview, the Triple Nickel Squadron, the squadron that I flew with, is flying over Afghanistan on a regular basis. But their mission is quite different. They go up in the air, and they stay in the air for 6 or 7 hours and refuel and refuel and refuel. And as soon as they're needed, they're airborne alert, they go ahead and support. We didn't ever do that. We had missions where we would brief, we would take off, we'd hit a target, we'd come back. And so their mission is much, much different. They're getting a lot of flying time. But it's a long mission, and they're single seat. The F-16 is a single seat airplane. The F-4 is a dual seat airplane. So we had somebody in the back to help us as far as if we were getting really tired. So the longest mission I had in combat was about 4 hours. And these guys are flying missions that are sometimes almost twice as long as that. But we stay in close contact, the old guys and the young guys. The squadron commander today is a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Vince O'Connor, and his call sign is Crush. And Crush and I go back and forth by email, and I send him books and tell him stories and all that. And one of the reasons that I'm doing this video is for him and his pilots and his support people, because I'm going to send a bunch of these videos over to them, either at their base in Afghanistan or when they return to their base in Aviano, which is their permanent base, so they can hear these stories and reflect on some of the things that we went through. When the Air Force decided they were going to close down the squadron, the war was over, they were taking a lot of squadrons down, and they were going to disestablish the Triple Nickel Squadron. Well, those of us who had flown in the Nickel were very upset about that, because it was the real big squadron. It shot down many more airplanes than any other squadron over there, and we thought it needed to be preserved. And so there was a major effort in the Pentagon, fortunately led by a general officer who had been the commander, Bob Taylor, when we were over there, and he generated enough interest to keep the squadron going. They turned it into an F-15 squadron, and then later into an F-16 squadron. But if it hadn't been for Bob Taylor being in a key position in Washington and working with the programmers to make sure, okay, we can close a bunch of squadrons down, but why close the most important squadron in the Vietnam War? Don't do that. And they were able to keep it alive and showed it that it had so much history that you couldn't get rid of it. So nobody who's with the Nickel now, or nobody who will be in the Nickel anytime in the future, would be there if it hadn't been for the work of Major General Bob Taylor, who saved the Nickel. And so it's a wonderful story. Now, there were some characters when we were over there that I need to talk about. One was Greg Boynton. Greg Boynton was the son of the famous Pappy Boynton, Medal of Honor recipient, Marine fighter pilot who was so important during the period of the World War II. Greg Boynton was his son. So when you saw Boynton, you say, well, he comes from very good lineage because his dad had been a fighter pilot. Another one who was quite important was a guy named Harry Spanis. Harry Spanis was a major, and he was a flight commander, and later he became the operations officer. But his history as a pilot was quite extraordinary. He had dead-sticked, before he even got over there, he had dead-sticked 11 different airplanes. He dead-sticked F-106s, T-33s, all kinds of it. A dead stick means you run out of power, and you've got an airplane which is a glider, and it's dropping very quickly, and he dead sticked and landed successfully 11 airplanes. And I don't think there's anybody in the history of the Air Force, except people who fly out of Edwards and do all kinds of testing, those people, test pilots, but regular operational people who ever did that much. So he had a great experience. He's a great guy, and fortunately, he's still around. Another really interesting aspect of the Triple Nickel Squadron is the fact that the fellow who is the commander of the United States Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, is the son of one of the Nichols who was with us, and his name is Goldfein. And the nice thing about the Goldie story is this particular guy, who's a four-star general, who's the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, he commanded the Nickel as a lieutenant colonel when he was flying out of Aviano. So his association with the Nickel and his father's association with the Nickel, and the fact that he's now the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, makes the Nickel even more kind of impressive. So right now, the Nickel is really on a roll. It's got a great commander, a bunch of great guys, and they have great history, and they have a man they can look to at the top who's the number one man in the Air Force. His name is Goldfein. Goldie, his dad, flew with us back in the 68, 69, and three of his sons all were fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. He produced a progeny of incredible people, and he and his wife Mary, Goldie, is well into his 80s now. He is the godfather of the squadron. He's been taking care of the squadron for 50 years, and hopefully will do it for a number of years. So there are a number of characters that we ran into of particular note that I think we need to mention. The F-4 was a very, very good airplane. It had two engines. It had two pilots, one in the front and one in the back. It could carry a huge amount of ordnance. It was easy to fly. It was easy to land. It was easy to refuel. It was a very forgiving airplane. I never once in 180 missions declared an aircraft emergency. I declared some emergencies because there were times when one time the field went completely black, and I had to declare an emergency to get to another field. So I declared an emergency occasionally, but never involved with the airplane. So when I came back and finished flying the F-4, I thought, they would never invent an airplane better than this. This was the cat's meow. And then I had the opportunity to fly the F-15, and I realized that the F-15 was much, much better than the F-4. But when you think about it, it was 50 years ago. This was a supersonic airplane. It had a radar. It had a bombing system. It could carry a lot of business. You could refuel the airplane. It was a very modern airplane, and yet, think about it. That was 50 years ago. And the airplanes we have today are considerably better. In many ways, they're better. They're more stealthy. They have more power. They got better electronics and so forth. But it is still an awfully good airplane. There's still some F-4s flying around the world in certain places, like in Turkey and so forth. The airplane is still around. When I went out to Nellis to be the speaker at a big event they had out there, what happens is the squadron comes back from Aviano, comes all the way back, and for about 3 months they fly out of Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada doing all kinds of training. They have red flag and green flag and all this business so that they get some really, really good training in all dimensions. And they asked me to come back, go there and make a speech. So I did. It was the first time I'd gotten together with the Nickel in a long time. So I had a chance to sit down with the squadron commander, be with a lot of the young guys, and talk about what was like now. Okay, to understand the Triple Nickel and my role in the Triple Nickel, you really have to go back when I chose to go to flying school when I was at West Point. I was at West Point. I came from an Army family. The idea would be I'd go into the Army. I'd served 30 years in the Army like my dad had done. But then one day I fell in love with aviation. I watched the Thunderbirds fly. I said I wanted to be like one of those guys. And so I volunteered to go in the Air Force. And the Air Force Academy was not open yet, so West Point allowed 1/4 of its graduates in 1956, the year I graduated, to go into the Air Force if you had good eyes and you graduated reasonably high in your class. And I had good eyes, and I graduated pretty high in my class, so off to flying school I went. Well, I got very sick many, many times in flying school, and I realized the only airplane I could fly where I wouldn't get sick would be one that I flew all by myself. So I fought hard to go into single-seat, single-engine airplanes, and that's what I did. And I flew F-100s, which was a fighter, for 6 years. Then I went off to graduate school, went to the Air Force Academy, and next thing I knew, I had an assignment to go to learn how to fly the F-4, the new F-4 in those days, and then go to combat. So I went to Homestead Air Force Base for about 6 months, learned how to fly the F-4, drop bombs, and all the things you had to do, fly formation, refueling, all the things you had to do. And then I was very fortunate because I was able to ferry an airplane all the way from Hill Air Force Base, all the way to Da Nang, and then on to Udorn. So I arrived at Udorn then in the period of August 1968 for a full-year tour. Prior to that time, people would stay for 100 missions, but they changed the rules, and we would stay for a whole year. So we all knew we would fly a lot more than 100 missions, but the missions were not all that demanding, and we were running through pilots so quickly they decided to go to such situation. So I got off the C-130 at Udorn, Thailand, and I ought to tell you where Udorn, Thailand is, and we'll have a map that shows where it is. It's in northern Thailand, very near the Laotian border, a very good location if we were going to conduct operations over Laos and over North Vietnam. There were lots of missions there, but the primary mission was F-4s and RF-4s. And RF-4 is a reconnaissance airplane. The F-4 is a fighter and a fighter-bomber airplane. At Udorn, Thailand, there were many, many missions, but ours, the fighter mission, was the most important. And we had a wing commander there named Wendell Bevan, who was a full colonel, and later he would be promoted to brigadier general while he was there. He supervised all the fighter people and also all the reconnaissance people. So he was in charge of 6, 8, 10,000 people. But we got to know him quite well. He flew with us. He was a reconnaissance pilot, but he also flew some fighter missions. So he wanted to be able to understand the fighter business. But he also was a really, really good guy. And in many cases, he really hung it out for the troops. He really cared for the troops. He listened to the troops. And when the troops thought we were doing something really dumb, he'd say, let's quit doing it. And if the troops came up with a really good idea, he'd say, well, let's do it if we possibly can. And the best example of Wendell Bevan, and the reason I want to talk about him, he was really a special guy, and he's been forgotten by history, was we had a tactics conference we hosted at Udorn, Thailand in the spring of 1969. And we had fighter people from all over the world. We had them from Nellis Air Force Base, the home of the fighters. We had them from the Pentagon. We had them from Hawaii. We had them from Saigon. We had them from all kinds of places. They came in for about 4 or 5 days to look at one particular mission. And the mission was the interdiction campaign over Laos. The interdiction campaign was a campaign to try to stop the flow or slow down the flow of enemy materiel coming out of North Vietnam through Laos and then back into South Vietnam. And there were a lot of trails and all that business, and we were trying to figure out a way to slow it down or stop it if we possibly could. Well, we had this conference, and we had it broken down into committees and all that business. And the basic conclusion of the conferees, there were probably 100 of them, was the interdiction campaign in Laos was a failure. That's what we thought, because we were so restricted in what targets we could hit and all kinds of rules of engagement that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so we put the executive summary together, and on top of that, the cover letter that Colonel Wendell Bevan would send down to all these places, to Saigon, to the Pacific, to the Pentagon. We said in the first sentence, the interdiction campaign in Laos is a failure. And that was what we wanted him to sign. So I went into his office with another officer who had actually written most of this. I'd written some. And I said, sir, we're about ready to get you in big trouble. He says, oh, why is that? We said, we're going to tell it like it is. We want you to sign this letter. He says, do you think it's the truth? And we said, we do. And it was the consensus of the entire group that it was the truth. He says, if you think it's the truth and we ought to sign it, I will sign it. And he did. He signed it. He didn't modify it. He didn't soften it up. He didn't sweeten it up. He just signed what we had said. And then we did something really smart. We ran off copies of this 100-page report and gave it to everybody out the door because we wanted them to have it, because we felt we probably would have it stopped somewhere along the way, but we wanted them to have it. So they walked out the door. We worked all night, and they walked out the door. Each one of these conferees walked out the door with a full report, including the cover letter, copy of the cover letter. About 3 weeks later, I got a call from Colonel Bevan's office. Major Smith, report to Colonel Bevan's office right away. So I thought, oh. So I went in to see him. By this time, my colleague had gone. He'd left. So it was me by myself. He says, Perry, you know what just happened to me? And I said, well, no, sir. He says, I just got chewed out for 30 minutes. And the only thing I said was, yes, sir, no, sir, and no excuse, sir. He was a West Point, and we learned that at West Point. And I said, I bet I know what you were being chewed out about. He said, you got it right. And I said, did we make a mistake? He said, no. We had to tell it like it was. I was willing to take the heat. We had it well documented and all that kind of stuff. But that was the kind of guy that Wendell Bevan was. And he was the one that later on I threw over the bar. And I've already told that story when he said, yes, I want to be thrown over the bar because I want to be like a real fighter pilot. So he was an important person. The next person that was really important in a leadership role is the one I need to talk about a little bit, and that was the squadron commander. Remember that Wendell Bevan was the wing commander, so he had 8,000 people working for him. The squadron commander had a smaller number of people. He had the 50 fighter pilots plus some other people, and his name was George Hupp, H-U-P-P. I had never met him before. I arrived on the scene, and it turned out that he and I had been stationed in the same squadron in F-100s earlier than that. And I guess that gave me some credibility because he very quickly allowed me to be a four-ship flight lead. He was very quiet. He wasn't full of enthusiasm and all that stuff, but he was the kind of guy that would listen to people. He was very wise and had great admiration for George Hupp. George Hupp is no longer with us. As a number two guy, the operations guy, Lum Brantley, is no longer with us. But then there was a real character by the name of Fire Can Dan Walsh. Fire Can Dan Walsh was the assistant operations officer, and he'd been a fighter pilot since I guess he was 12. I don't know. He had fighter business background in there, and he really understood the business. And he would sort out people. He knew the people who were good, and he knew the people that were a little shaky. And he would always be sure that whoever was leading the flight knew what the heck they were doing and all that kind of business. So he was another person that was really, really very special in that nickel. So we had some really good leadership at the very top and at the squadron level, and so people were comfortable with that. Not everybody was a good pilot. Not everybody was great in the air, but most of them were pretty darn good, and the ones who weren't so good, we kind of watched out for to make sure that we didn't get them into situations that were too tough for them to handle. The F-4 was designed by the United States Navy, not by the United States Air Force. The Air Force was not working very hard on fighter airplanes during the era of Curtis LeMay and big airplanes and bombers and all that business. And the Navy was, because they had to have fighters because they couldn't have bombers, big bombers, on their carriers. Well, they designed a very good airplane made by McDonnell Douglas, and the Air Force decided we needed to get them quick. The production line was underway. The Air Force made some modifications, a little different from what the Navy did, but the airplane basically was the same, and it turned out to be a very good airplane. The reason it was very good was, one, it was well designed, and two, it had two very powerful engines. And you need a lot of power when you're taking off with, 11 different bombs and tanks and missiles and all that kind of business. You need a lot of power, and most of the airplanes we'd had up to that time were a little bit underpowered. Well, this airplane had a lot of power, and that was good in a number of dimensions. One is you could take off and get things in the air, but also you could go very fast, particularly if somebody was shooting at you, because you had all that power, and you could light the afterburners that would give you even more power when you needed it, and that was very helpful. And the other thing about the airplane, it was really quite maneuverable. And this was interesting because when you were being shot at on the ground, if you could see the bullets coming up, you could watch the tracers coming up, you could outmaneuver the bullets because you could just move that airplane really fast and really hard with all that power and all that speed and all that energy, and the bullets would go behind you. You had to see them coming, and you sometimes would and sometimes wouldn't. But in the daytime, and particularly around dusk, we would wear yellow goggles. And yellow goggles would allow you to see an actual bullet which wasn't a tracer. You could just see this black thing coming up at you. And if it was going that way, you didn't worry about it. If it was going that way, you didn't worry about it. But if it was coming this way and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it was headed for you, and that's when you had to crank the airplane around. So that was fine if you were being shot at by one ground position. The problem sometimes was you were being shot at by more than one position. And if you tried to outmaneuver these bullets, the other bullets would come the other way. And probably the most dramatic moment I had was when I was flying in support of the Spectre gunships, where I was having to roll in on the guns to try to stop the guns from shooting down the 130 Spectre gunship. And I would roll in, and all of a sudden, all these tracers were coming up this way and that way, and there was nothing I could do to out. And so I just had to drive on down, drop my ordnance, and then jink out. We always were moving the airplane. We call it jinking. Keep jinking. Move, move, move. And my backseater would remind me all the time, keep jinking, keep jinking, keep jinking. Well, I think it might be interesting to talk about some of the emergencies I ran into. I didn't run into many, but there were a few that were interesting. There was a bullpup missile, which you would control with a little stick. You'd shoot it off, and you could direct it, and we used it against caves because the Laotian military bad guys and the North Vietnamese would oftentimes store stuff in caves during the daytime, and then they'd bring it out in the nighttime. And we knew where the caves were, but it was hard to get to them with a bomb because the bomb would come this way, and the cave was this way. Well, the bullpup missile would shoot straight out, and then you would kind of steer it with his little stick, and it would take you, hopefully, to go into the cave. Well, I was one of the few people in the squadron that was qualified to shoot the bullpup. For some reason, they said, you're qualified. I said, okay. So I went in to shoot a bullpup. I think it was the first one I fired. I fired the bullpup, and within about 2 seconds, it blew up right in front of me. It did boom, like that. So I pulled the airplane up real quick so I didn't go through all the debris. And when I landed, and I wrote it up, and I said, little problem, bullpup blew up at 3 seconds after firing. Well, the maintenance and the munitions guys came down and said, that couldn't have happened. That doesn't happen. You couldn't have. It didn't blow up. Well, fortunately, we had what was called a strike camera on the F-4 that would show what you had done. And so we went over and looked at the film, and there it was. Boom! There was this huge explosion. So I got the maintenance people, and I got the munitions people, and I said, okay, let me show you what really happened. And they said, oh my gosh. Well, somehow or other, the safety allowed it to get out a little while, and it armed. It armed after 3 seconds, but it wasn't supposed to blow after 3 seconds. So that was kind of interesting. It didn't hurt me, but it kind of scared me. Another emergency we had was I was flying at night with a wingman. We were coming back from a mission. It was maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, a very, very dark night. A lot of rain and thunderstorms and all that business. And I'm getting a little low on gas, but that's fine. I'm going to land at Udorn, my base. I'm coming down, and I'm about 10 miles out, and all of a sudden, boom, everything goes black. The whole city goes black, and the whole base goes black, and there's nothing there but black. And nobody to talk to. The whole power system had been knocked out by lightning or something. Had nobody to talk to. Couldn't land because I couldn't find anything. So I then had to divert. So I called the traffic agency, the people who took care of us in the air. I said, I got to go somewhere else. They said, well, how about a tanker? How would you like to get a tanker? We could find a tanker for you. I said, no, it's a really bad night. I said, rather than try to find a tanker and maybe not find him and maybe not be able to refuel, I'll just divert. And so I diverted to another base, and that was a kind of a nice opportunity because I went to the bar that night because I couldn't fly anymore, and there was a guy there who was an operations officer of a wing down there. His name was Doc Blanchard. Well, Doc Blanchard was the great football player, Heisman Trophy winner from West Point. I had never met him before. And here he was, fighter pilot. He was a colonel, I was a major. And we had a nice conversation about Army football and about flying airplanes and all that kind of stuff. And the next day, then I got my airplane and flew back to Udorn, and the emergency was over. I spent about 3 weeks in a hospital when I was at Udorn. I had what was called the fighter pilot disease. And it was the result of pulling all those G's for so many years that they had to repair my bottom. And as a result of that, it was an operation that I had to wait to do it, and I was there. And so I was in a hospital room for about 3 weeks, wasn't flying. But then all these people that were being wounded were coming into the hospital. They were in the same ward with me, so I would talk to them. And the one I remember the most was a fighter guy who was an F-105 guy who had been shot up so badly that he had to jump out. And when he jumped out, the airplane was out of control, and it was going about 500 knots. And when he went out, there was so much wind blast that he broke both arms, and one arm and 2 legs. Just went every possible direction. So he was really beat up. He had one good arm, and he was right across the way. And so he's talking to his wing commander. This is a young lieutenant fighter pilot. He says, "Oh, sir, I'm really sorry that I had to jump out of the airplane." You could hear the guy on the other end say, "No, it's okay. It's okay. You had to do that. But, sir, I didn't want to jump out. That's why I stayed with the airplane so long." He was just devastated that he had to jump out of that airplane. And he was all beat up, but they hauled him off to the Philippines, I guess, put him all back together. But when you jump out of an airplane at a very, very high speed, as some people had to do when they were shot at and shot down, what it does to your body is very bad. And you think about the John McCain example. He was very, very badly wounded because as he came out of the airplane, he got a lot of wind damage, and he almost died, as you know, in the prison camp. We lost a lot of people at the Udorn, but it wasn't dramatically large. In other words, about every 2 months we'd lose an airplane. In some cases we get the crew back. They'd be rescued. In some cases we wouldn't get them back, and then we had a big question about whether they made it or not. Some of them were picked up and went to Hanoi and spent 5 or 6 years there. Some of them were shot and killed on the ground. And we heard one colonel who was shot down who narrated his death. He said, "They're going to kill me. They're coming in all directions." And then at the very end, he says, "Oh, I've been hit. Oh, I've been hit again. Roll in, shoot them. I'm finished. Roll in on the bad guys." He says, "There's no chance I'm going to live." And he didn't. He was killed. If you got shot down in Laos, you died. If you got shot down in North Vietnam, you had a chance of living. So it was fairly hazardous. You didn't want to get shot down. And if you did get shot down, you wanted to get rescued really quickly. And that's why these Jolly Green Giants and the rescue people were just essential. And they were stationed both at Udorn, where we were, and also a base called NKP, which is really close to the Laotian border. And as soon as there was an emergency, they were sitting there on cockpit alert, ready to go. They'd get in the air and they'd go rescue people. And they had some wonderful, wonderful stories. One of the great stories from the Nickel was the story of Roger Locker. This was not when I was there, but Roger Locker got shot down north of Hanoi. And the rules were, you don't go try to rescue somebody north of Hanoi. There's no way, because it's too dangerous. You don't want to risk too many airplanes. Well, he tried to work his way across the Red River and get into the mountains to be rescued. And he went without food for 23 days. And finally comes up on the radio and he says, "I've gone as far as I can go. Could you possibly come pick me up?" And the decision was made that day by a 4-star general by the name of John Vogt. He says, "We're going to go get that guy." And they lost 119 airplanes in the air that day. They had refueling airplanes, they had fighter airplanes, they had helicopters, they had all kinds of jammers, all that kind of business. And they went in and got Roger Locker, even though he was well north of Hanoi. Well, there were MiGs in the air, and they were shooting at him in all directions. And when they picked Roger Locker up into the helicopter, he hadn't eaten in 24 days. The guy who was flying the airplane was a guy named Stovall, who I knew a little bit, and he handed him a box of cookies that his wife had sent to him. And he said, "Have some cookies there." And Roger Locker, instead of eating the cookies, started putting the cookies in his beat-up old flying suit. And Dale Stovall said, "Why are you doing that?" He says, "Oh, we're going to get shot down, and I want to have something to eat when I get on the ground." Well, they didn't get shot down, and they brought him back, and he was a nickel. He was a triple nickel guy, and it was the most dramatic and probably the most important rescue of the entire Vietnam War. And it was done because a 4-star general was willing to take the risk to get one guy. And it tells a really nice story about how we feel about our soldiers and our aviators. And I've never met Roger Locker. I've talked to him on the phone. I know Dale Stovall pretty well. And then finally, when the combat tour was over in late August of 1969, I worked my way back to the United States, met Connor in San Francisco, and we had a great reunion. I'd survived. Remember now, her dad had not survived. He was exactly the same age I was when he was killed in combat in World War II, and so she was really happy to see me. The kids were really happy to see me. The combat tour was over, and then I went back and started teaching at the Air Force Academy, where I had been there before. We call it a combat sabbatical. We were over there for a year, and then we came back, and I continued to teach. I consider myself a fighter pilot, even though I had a lot of staff jobs and educational jobs and all that. When somebody asked me, "What do you do in the Air Force?" I say, I was a fighter pilot. And that was kind of cool. To be a fighter pilot was very special. I mean, bomber pilots are great, and cargo pilots are great, and helicopter pilots are great. But in my day, back in the 50s and early 60s, to be a fighter pilot was really special. And people would ask me, they would say, "Have you ever been supersonic?" Now, this is back in the 50s. And I would kid with them, and I'd say, "Yeah, what's it like to go supersonic?" I said, "Well, your blood boils just a little bit, but it's okay." Well, it turns out going supersonic in an F-100, you didn't even know you were going supersonic. It wasn't like hitting the barrier. They had designed the airplanes, and so the F-4 was real easy. When you went through the speed of sound, you hardly noticed. In combat, we normally didn't go supersonic because we had all these bombs and all that. But if you really needed to go supersonic, you could light the afterburners and do it. Now, one thing about afterburners is you didn't want to light the afterburners at night, because immediately the people on the ground could see you really well. And so we had one Southern guy in our squadron who was famous for a term at night: "Don't light the burners, don't light the burners." And we used to kid him a lot because he had this great, wonderful Southern voice. But we all agreed, you don't light the burners. Another thing you didn't do at night is you didn't turn on any of your outside lights. Now, normally, you'd fly at night, you have these lights on so people could see you and all that. But when you went into combat, you had to be really careful about turning all your lights off. Well, I had one friend named J.R. Alley who was flying this mission with Spectre Escort, going in and dropping bombs on the anti-aircraft artillery positions, and he forgot to turn off his lights. And all of a sudden, everybody was shooting at him because they could see him. And he realized as he pulled off, "Oh my gosh, I forgot he turned the lights off in a hurry." So there were things that you had to be really careful about. And turning off the lights and moving the airplane all the time in order to avoid all the ground fire was all part of the process.
After completing his combat tour, Perry moved on to other military assignments, including 2 tours at the Air Force Academy, 3 operational assignments in Germany, 2 tours in the Pentagon, and 2 tours at the National War College. His most rewarding leadership position was as commander of the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing, which was equipped with 80 brand new F-15 aircraft. After 30 years on active duty in the Air Force, Smith and his wife Connor settled down in her hometown, Augusta, Georgia. He spends his time teaching, writing, and working in support of worthy causes. He has published 6 books, including Rules and Tools for Leaders, Assignment Pentagon, and Courage, Compassion, Marine, the unique story of Jimmy Dias.